And welcome to the Nitro Show, college football from a Georgia perspective. My name is Streit, and not with me tonight is Burl. He's a little bit under the weather this week, so I'll be flying solo tonight. We're going to take a break from our series that we've been doing on conference grades and focus on some stories that are going on this week. But don't worry, we'll be back next week as we cover the Big Ten Conference and move on across the country. On tonight's show, I'm going to be discussing a number of stories that have been going on in college football since the season came to an end a few weeks ago, including Ohio State losing both of its coordinators, a major change concerning NIL taxation here in the state of Georgia, some players showing out during Senior Bowl week, and I'm going to take a look at some quarterback battles that will have the nation's attention this spring. But before I get started, I want to say thanks to everyone who has been listening to this podcast. We really appreciate you listening. If you could, please subscribe and leave us a like and leave us a comment. It really helps us grow the show. Now, let's move on. So first story this week, Ohio State has lost both of the coordinators that helped it win a national championship. Defensive coordinator Jim Knowles has taken the job at Penn State. James Franklin saw that he couldn't beat Ohio State, so he went out and got the best that he could buy. Penn State paid Jim Knowles a ton of money, and Jim Knowles left Columbus for Penn State. It seems like it was kind of an ugly situation. They asked Jim Knowles not to come to their celebration after winning the championship. I'm sure there's more to the story there, but it just seems like an ugly situation all around. So Ohio State is now left to find a new defensive coordinator. The search is underway, but there's been many candidates who have been named, but they haven't found one yet. One name that I did see popped up was Oregon co-defensive coordinator Chris Hampton. So perhaps Ohio State's going to stay in conference and steal one from the team that was able to beat them in the regular season this year. Later this last week, Chip Kelly, offensive coordinator at Ohio State, also announced that he was leaving, and he's headed back to the NFL. He is taking the offensive coordinator job with the Las Vegas Raiders. Chip Kelly is going to be replaced in Columbus by Brian Hartline, who has been the Ohio State receivers coach the last few years, considered to be an excellent recruiter and just absolutely a key part in them landing all these crazy, great receiving prospects that they've had the last few years in Columbus. At the end of the day, when you win a national championship, teams are going to come after your assistant coaches. They're going to come to try to make them head coaches. They're going to come showing money. That's what happens with success. It's something that Alabama has dealt with for years under Nick Saban. He was constantly, replacing his offensive coordinators, replacing his defensive coordinators, replacing his assistants. And he was able to do it, finding oftentimes people that needed some rehabilitation. Lane Kiffin, Bill O'Brien, Steve Sarkisian. But Nick Saban was able to do that really well and keep his program successful. Georgia has kind of dealt with the same thing in the last few years. After the 2021 season, Kirby Smart, of course, lost Dan Lanning when he took the job at Oregon, and now Dan Lanning has become a successful head coach at Oregon, taking his team to the Big Ten championship and to the playoff this year. After the 2022 season, Georgia offensive coordinator Todd Monken left for the Baltimore Ravens, where he has had huge success this year and might have the MVP in Lamar Jackson playing for him. So when you are a national championship team, you are going to deal with this year in, year out. People are going to come for your coordinators, and how you respond and who you hire is going to determine whether your program stays successful. I think Ryan Day, has an opportunity here to go out and hire another strong defensive coordinator who will inherit a situation that's very good. They've got a lot of talent up there, and they are the defending national champions. So a lot of momentum, but it is a season of change up there in Columbus. Up next, we have a change to NIL law here in the state of Georgia. So there is a proposal on the table that would exempt college athletes' NIL money from counting towards their state income tax. This is a change because in Georgia, we do have state income tax, but in other states, they don't have state income tax. And so when somebody earns money for NIL, well, they just get to pocket it and don't have to pay state taxes. You often hear about this a lot when you're talking about pro sports players and their contract negotiations. You go places where they don't have state income tax, and so the contract there, though may have a lesser value overall, is actually worth more than a contract in another state simply because of the amount they are taxed. So if this goes through, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp has already made an executive order to allow for the college programs to actually pay players directly. And I think that's dependent on that NCAA class action lawsuit that's going on with the federal government. But once the clearing goes through so that players can be paid directly by their schools, Georgia is now lined up to do that as a state. And this law will only help, be able to attract players based on compensation, which, as everyone knows, this is kind of the name of the game that's going on these days. Up next, we have the Senior Bowl, which took place last week and weekend over there in Mobile, Alabama. There were a number of highlighted players that had some good showings, and I wanted to touch on a few of those here. Number one is quarterback Jackson Dart from Ole Miss. This quarterback class going to the NFL took a couple hits when a few guys that were considered higher prospects backed out. Carson Beck and Drew Aller. Some other players, Quinn Ewers, didn't quite live up to their billing this season. And so the quarterback draft class is kind of seen as not as strong as it once did. You still got Shedeur Sanders, you've got Cam Ward, who are kind of the leaders up at the top. But by his performance at the Senior Bowl this week, Jackson Dart has seemed to move up that list and is now in line to potentially be the number 3 quarterback taken in the NFL draft later this spring. Another player that coming into this college football season was viewed as like a top star, but then you really didn't hear much about him this year, was Ollie Gordon, running back from Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State had an abysmal season this year, and Ollie Gordon, over his first couple of years was one of the best in the country, but kind of just quietly went away and didn't have huge stats this year. But from everything that I saw, he had a great week at the Senior Bowl. They said he was in great shape. And so he's another guy that you may look towards climbing up the draft boards, particularly at the running back position as we head into the NFL draft. From a Georgia standpoint, there's a couple of notes from the Senior Bowl. Number one, I couldn't help but notice all the highlights and praise being heaped on Arian Smith. Arian Smith was making some fantastic catches, and all Georgia fans were like, what is going on? Where was this Arian Smith all season long? Because as we know, I think he led the country in drops, and he was Georgia's leading receiver. But if he had a little bit better time catching the ball, he'd have been amongst the leaders in the country in receiving yards. So good for Arian Smith, improving his draft stock and hoping to maybe wash away some of the bad memories that were left from this season. Another person that I saw mentioned quite a lot this week was Trevor Etienne. He only spent 1 year at Georgia after 2 years at Florida, and lots of people thought that maybe he was going to come back for one more year in Georgia, but at the last minute, he decided to go pro, and he ended up going to the Senior Bowl because juniors are now allowed to go to the Senior Bowl. And for all intents and purposes, he had a great week there. He was voted the top running back at the Senior Bowl and was really noted for his hands, for catching the ball in the backfield, making some good plays in practice and as well as in the Senior Bowl game. So hats off to Trevor Etienne running up that running back board. Another guy that got a lot of mention from the Senior Bowl was safety Dan Jackson, former Georgia walk-on Dan Jackson, who was arguably one of Georgia's best players on defense all year this year. Had the key hit in the Georgia Tech game to cause the fumble that let Georgia tie the game late and send that game to overtime. And he was a guy, once again, a no-star prospect, walk-on at Georgia, spent 6 years there. But after this performance during both the season and this week at Senior Bowl, it sure looks like he's going to be headed to the draft and hearing his name called, which is another fantastic story of how Georgia has developed walk-on players over the last few years. And my last topic for tonight, and this is something that I want to hear from you, the audience, on, is who do you think are going to win some of the big quarterback battles that we're going to see across college football this offseason? There's a lot of high-profile teams that are looking for a new starting quarterback after their starter from this year, either having transferred or moved on to the NFL or just quit football altogether. So here are a couple of high-profile quarterback battles that you're going to be seeing this spring. Let's start down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where Alabama will be looking to find a new starting quarterback to replace Jalen Milroe. Now, this story gets a little more interesting because just this week, Alabama has hired a new offensive coordinator. They've hired Ryan Grubb, who was the offensive coordinator for Kalen DeBoer at Washington and Fresno State. And so they're kind of getting the band back together after that first year down in Tuscaloosa, where the offense kind of never really found its groove. DeBoer went and got his guy, and now they are back together. So we will see what happens. They've got 3 leading candidates to be the starting quarterback at Alabama next year. It starts with Ty Simpson, former 5-star, who's been in the program for quite a few years now. He's seen some mop-up duty here and there, but has never really impressed enough to the point where he could overtake Jalen Milroe when Milroe was struggling throughout the last couple of years. But he's been in the program longest, and he does have experience, but he does have the disadvantage of being a Saban recruit versus being a DeBoer recruit. The second candidate is Austin Mack. Austin Mack is real interesting because he has just transferred to Alabama from Washington, where he originally committed to play football for DeBoer and for Grubb. He knows their system. And so despite him not being quite the flash names of the other guys on this list, he may have an inside track just because he simply knows their system really well. And with Grubb coming in, it might be an easy transition to bring in a quarterback that already knows his system versus a guy like Ty Simpson, who has been in multiple offensive systems over the last couple of years. The third candidate is Keelan Russell. Keelan Russell is the number 2 quarterback prospect in the class of 2025 out of the state of Texas. Just a big name that's got a lot of Alabama fans excited. He's got to get on campus and compete with these guys who already have a leg up. But anytime you have a 5-star quarterback coming in, he's coming in and wanting playing time. So I fully expect that he'll be in this competition right up until the season starts. Moving on from Tuscaloosa, let's go out to Colorado, where Deion Sanders is going to look to replace his son, Shedeur Sanders, at quarterback. They've got 2 leading candidates for that position right now. Number 1 is Caden Salter. He is a transfer quarterback from Liberty, where the last 2 years he has been a fantastic quarterback for Liberty. So this guy's coming in. He's a true dual threat and has put up a ton of points, as Liberty has been, one of the better teams out of the group of 5 over the last couple of years. His main competition is Juju Lewis, a freshman from Carrollton, Georgia, 5-star, who was originally part of the class of 2026. He reclassified. Those of us here in Georgia are very familiar with Julian Lewis. We've been hearing about him since he was a freshman. Georgia was trying to get him, but he ultimately chose to go with Deion Sanders out there to Boulder. So we'll see who wins the job out there between Caden Salter and Julian Lewis. Up next, right here in Georgia, we've got the battle going on between Gunnar Stockton and Ryan Puglisi. Obviously, Gunnar Stockton has the leg up right now. He came in the SEC championship game and performed well, in relief of Carson Beck, and was able to help lead the Dogs to an SEC championship, forced him to start in the Sugar Bowl. Had a pretty good game, threw for 240 yards, didn't make too many mistakes, didn't get a lot of help from his running game. And so, he had a good game, but his offensive line didn't play great. His receivers certainly didn't help him with some drops again. But he's got the leg up. Obviously, he's got a huge pedigree from the state of Georgia, an owner of a number of high school passing records here from his time in Tiger, Georgia. And the main competition from him is Ryan Puglisi, who's going to be a redshirt freshman this year. Originally came in the class of 2024, was another big recruit. And he was committed to Georgia the whole time, even when Georgia had Dylan Raiola committed. Puglisi never wavered. He wanted to come in and be developed. He's from Connecticut, I believe. And there's been lots of rumbling all season long about how impressive this guy is. He's got a big, strong arm. And even though outside of Athens and outside of the Georgia fan base, people may think this is Stockton's job, I'm telling you, there is going to be a competition between these two guys in the spring. And it wouldn't surprise me if Puglisi wins the job. So we will see what happens down there in Athens. Moving across the state and over to Auburn, where this year Auburn is going to have a unique starting quarterback battle between 2 transfers. First, Auburn went out and got Jackson Arnold, former 5-star who was the starter at Oklahoma for most of this last season. He had some flashes at Oklahoma, but a decimated receiving core made it hard for him to really show out, and he battled a few injuries himself. He did show out as a runner in some games, particularly in that Alabama game. He was the hero of that game, and so he transfers over to Auburn. But they also went out and got a second quarterback out of the transfer portal, Ashton Daniels, who had been the starter at Stanford. Another guy coming in who can solidify the position and at least provide a solid backup if Arnold is ultimately the starter until they get Deuce Knight there, a freshman who's coming in ready. So we'll see what happens out there on the plains, be it Arnold, Daniels, or maybe Knight sneaks up and takes the job from both of them. And the last quarterback battle that I want to touch on is up in Columbus at Ohio State. Now, Ohio State, won the national championship there this year with Will Howard, a transfer quarterback. But they have so much quarterback talent up there right now that's going to be competing for this job next year. How talented are they? They had two guys who were considered elite quarterback prospects transfer out of the program this year, and they still have 3 top 15 quarterbacks left in their system. It's absolutely nuts up there. Devin Brown and Aaron Nolan were the two that transferred away, but that leaves us with 3 guys who are competing for the job to attempt to lead Ohio State to a back-to-back national title next year. Number 1 is Julian Sayin. He was the number 3 quarterback in the class of 2024. Originally committed and signed with Alabama, though immediately transferred away from Alabama to Columbus. The second one is Lincoln Kienholz. He was the number 11 quarterback in the class of 2003. Not as flashy as the other 2 candidates, but he's been in the program longer than the other 2 guys, so I wouldn't count him out. And the number 3 candidate is Tavian St. Clair, a true freshman, number 3 quarterback in the class of 2025, another 5-star player, just a dynamic player that Ohio State fans are excited for. So when you've got this kind of talent up there, I expect that one of these guys is probably going to at least be the leader coming out of spring, and probably one of these guys is going to transfer because that's just the name of the game. Go somewhere and play if you can. But it's a good problem to have if you're Ohio State, and not a good problem for the rest of the country. So that's going to wrap it up for this week. I know it was a quick episode, just me kind of giving you some news stories, but thank you for tuning in. Once again, if you like the show, please, please, please subscribe and leave us a like, and leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts on all the topics I touched on today, from the quarterback battles to the Senior Bowl to anything else that's on your mind in the world of college football. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you next week. Go Dogs.